therein. Good afternoon, members. I call Committee of Supplies Section A to order. We are meeting today to continue the consideration of the budget of estimates of the Ministry of Forests. I now recognize the Minister to move the vote. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Resolved that a sum not exceeding $413,993,000 be granted to His Majesty to defray the expenses of the Ministry of Forests Ministry Operations to March 31st, 2025.
And as you are in the process of answering a question?
Yes. Thank you. Last day when we concluded, there was a question which posed by the member for Caribou-Chilcotin, who asked a question about the incentives or not for licensees to burn fiber, which they'd harvested. There was a question arising in his community of Williams Lake about burn piles being seen and burned when there might be an issue of whether that fiber was possibly able to be used in some industrial process. So so the question, if I could rephrase it, would be why do licensees burn fiber they don't use? So in the Forest Act, licensees have the discretion to leave residual fiber on site, but they must pay for it. Licensees generally leave residual fiber behind to improve the quality of the logs going to their mills, which improves mill efficiency and lowers cost. Under the Wildlife Act, licensees must meet hazard abatement obligations after logging. Burning is typically the lowest cost option for hazard abatement. However, burning is not the only option and is not an option required by government. In fact, the long-term trend has been for much fuller utilization of residual fiber and less burning, and there are some statistics to support that. Let me then, I've been given another question that I think is allied to the question that the member also asked. Why would a licensee leave fiber in the bush when there's a willing buyer? And the main answer, as I tried to explain yesterday, is that economics is the main reason. For example, trucking costs and costs to mobilize equipment to access and transport the residual fiber can be quite high. The main cost barrier is the distance between bush residuals, that's the fiber out there on the cut block, and the facility using them. In some cases, it would cost more to grind and haul than can be financially recovered by marketing the materials. So for small scattered piles, like the situation I think described in the question, could be cost prohibitive to gather this material together, then grind and haul to a facility. The most efficient way of improving utilization of residual fiber is through business-to-business relationships between primary harvesters and secondary users. There are no regulations or mechanism that would discourage licensees from fully utilizing the fiber, and I think that was the question from the member of Caribou-Chilcotin. Was there any hidden regulation or barrier to fully utilizing all the fiber on a cut block? So I hope that answers the member's question. Thank you.
Recognizing the member from Skeena.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, and thank you to my colleague for giving me time to ask a couple of questions on behalf of Skeena, the riding I represent. As the Minister probably knows, there's another mill being shut down in BC. I don't know what that number is total anymore, but Skeena Sawmills has actually been shut down and actually went into receivership. And the First Nations up there, for a long time, for long before I came along, wanted to own a facility of such size there to be part of the economy. And they thought that this was the opportunity, but they feel that the receivership process has actually cut them off, even though they tried to submit a bid. So Kitsum-Kalem is representing a proposal from all the First Nations in the area to combine their efforts to acquire the assets, but they feel that the receivership process does not consider Aboriginal rights and title as laid out by Section 35 of the Constitution, the Haida Court case of 2004, and even the government's own DRIPA Act. They've watched the speeches in terms of the throne speech, the budget speech for the past few years, and they truly believe there's an opportunity here if the government really wants to talk about partnerships with First Nations, especially on the land base, whether it be mining, forestry, or LNG for that matter. So they've submitted a proposal to talk about all the assets that's on the table right now. That includes the property and equipment, the Skeena Bioenergy pellet mill and equipment, FLA 1682, which represents 160,000 cubic meters of volume, FLA 16885, which represents 26,000 cubic meters, and TFL 41, which represents 128,000 meters of annual allowable cut. What Kitsim-Kalem would like is for the government to use all its resources and actually start a government-to-government relationship with Kitsim-Kalem and all the First Nations and work out a long-term plan for the future of the Skeena sawmill property and equipment. Basically what they're asking is intervene and start a process with First Nations in regards to DRIPA, as well as the economic component that's been laid out by the case law in the courts of Canada and BC. Is the minister willing to actually look at this proposal and get First Nations into the forestry operations within Skeena?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank the member for the question. In fact, this is coincidentally, or maybe not, this matter is in the Supreme Court in bankruptcy in Vancouver today, and there are the typical bankruptcy issues to consider, the concerns of creditors, and what would the disposition of the assets be. The ministry is obliged to, and has been advised legally, to remain at arm's length in this receivership process at this stage, because the government holds the role of both a regulator and a creditor. The ministry is owed money for stumpage from Skeena, unpaid stumpage revenue. So we understand that, and I think this is understood, that numerous parties, including First Nations and Kitsim-Kalem, who I'm familiar with and are a recognized accomplished forest operator, among many others in the Northwest. They're interested in the outcome of the receivership sale and transfers. But at this stage, it's premature at this stage for the government, given the legal advice that we've been given at this stage in the bankruptcy proceedings, to intervene.
Member.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, and thank the Minister for that question. And that's exactly why Kitsim-Kalem wants the government to actually intervene, because they feel that their rights and title is not being heard in a meaningful manner that's been described in this legislature under our UNDRIP debates, or as well as under DRIPA, the act that actually formalizes how First Nations participate in our economy. Basically what they want is government to use everything in their toolbox to live up to the commitment of DRIPA. That's what they're asking. They understand the Supreme Court. They understand all those processes. They just feel that they're just being treated like a regular stakeholder in those proceedings. And so I understand the request is outside of what the normal answer that government normally provides, but First Nations are expecting something different. Their expectations were heightened with DRIPA being enacted in BC. But they find that not only is everything basically the same, in some places it's getting worse, especially with Halfway River and Doig River taking the BC government to court over treaty interests that have been overridden. But I'll take that answer back to Kitsim-Kalem. I've got a similar situation here with a sawmill called Lake Drive Lumber in Terrace. It's a very small lumber mill but does an extraordinary amount of work in Skeena. Their lease is about to expire, and they didn't need to relocate. Across the road from them is a Kalem Lake, the Kalem Lake Road dump site that's currently being remediated. And they understand that it needs remediation under the regulations of BC. But there's a certain portion of land that does not need remediation. They would like to relocate across the road and continue their operations. This small mill supplies not only the region down here, but also across the province. They supply most of all the cedar products for all the local First Nations, for all their cultural activities. And if they can't find a site, any site, they're going to have to close their doors. They would like the government to consider looking at that dump site for them to locate, and if not, they would like the government to actually identify a parcel of Crown land that is not encumbered by any other third-party interest that would restrict them from relocating. So Bruce Anders, the owner at Lake Drive, has been doing this for 20 years. And for the amount of people they employ, there's a lot of people they employ. And they contribute quite a bit to the economy of Terrace. So they really need help, and they would like to know if the provincial government can step in and help so that they don't have to close their doors. Can I get some type of commitment from the minister or the government to say that they'll be in contact with them and help these guys out before they lose their lease and have to shut down?
Minister.
Thanks very much. I wanted to thank the member for the question. This is not an operation that I'm familiar with, but I appreciate him telling me about it. It's not something that the staff in the region have heard about up till now. But certainly we could and will commit to investigate it. The dump site may be, I don't know whether it's owned by the regional district or by the city or whether it's leased Crown land. And so it would involve Ministry of Forests, perhaps the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship, maybe the Regional District, and maybe the municipality. So certainly we will investigate, and I invite the member to contact me directly with that information about who staff might get a hold of, and we can agree to have a look at it. I gather from the concern that's expressed about the lease expiring that the clock is ticking, so we would undertake that expeditiously. So thank you.
Recognizing the member from Peace River North.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to my colleague from Peace River South for giving me the next 2 hours to ask a couple questions. No, just joking. One question for 2 hours. I do have a question, Chair, for the Minister, a couple of them.
Through the chair.
The Minister, I have, was hand-delivered a package here a couple of weeks back from some of my constituents in the just north of Fort St. John and in the Fort St. John area regarding a forest cleanup on Red Creek. I know that I've been in touch with the Minister a number of times since then. The issue goes even beyond the Red Creek subdivision, to which we're hoping to get cleaned up. We were pretty lucky last year. We skirted one of the fires, the Red Creek fire, which burnt very close proximity of the subdivision in Red Creek, but was extinguished in time. I have walked through the forest surrounding that area, and it's a disaster. There's no other way to put it. How much dead downfall that there is from the serious windstorm that happened some 2 years ago now. We've been trying to get this cleaned up and certainly, mitigate some safety issues and fire issues around this subdivision. Just wondering if the Minister can hopefully give us an update or give us a timeline for an update on this issue, as well as generally, there was a lot of damage done by this windstorm a couple years ago in other areas across the entire Northeast. Thanks.
Minister.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the member has provided me a package. I will maybe just make it clear for the record and for his constituent. He's also diligently buttonholed me at least 3 times since he gave me the package 10 days ago. So one can say safely on the record that he's certainly keeping track of this file and pushing it forward. Unfortunately, I don't have anything substantive to report. I would say in general terms, though, that the prospect of increased danger of wildfires really provides an opportunity, and I think forest management will and should be done differently as we face the prospect of heightened danger of fire throughout the forests of British Columbia. And this is an example where there are, if we manage differently, there are probably economic opportunities as well as the opportunity to make communities safe as we strip some of the undergrowth and hazardous flammable forest material away from around communities, and there are opportunities there. So I know that the package included a plan commissioned by a qualified consultant, and I'm just not able to report on the status of that at this point, but I'm sure the minister will ask me again and again, so until I give a detailed answer.
Member.
Well, I appreciate the promotion to minister, so I'll make that decision today if you need, sir. But I do appreciate that, and I will continue, obviously, to chase this, and hopefully, again, time is of the essence. We're moving into a potential another fire season, which we don't know what that looks like. So we'll continue to work on that. Another question I had is kind of more specific to Fort Nelson. There is, and it's kind of a twofold question here. There is a lot of potential in Fort Nelson, with forestry. It's predominantly untouched. It's been unscathed really by fires over the last number of years. To the northern part, obviously, we had Donnie Creek to the south, but there's talk and this was a paper from Future Skills Center and Smart Prosperity Institutes. The NDP government in BC talks a lot about promoting mass timber and engineered wood products, which is great, important. But as the Smart Prosperity Institute suggests, that if they want to walk the talk, they need to address a major pinch point, and that's the lack of adequate rail in northeastern BC, where there is ample timber supply. Now, I know this isn't directly your ministry in regards to CN, but what I do ask you is through your ministry and your channels to support resilient communities, such as Fort Nelson trying to move forward with a potential forest industry again, whether that be through pellet or mass timber or other opportunities, value-added opportunities and such, that I'm just wondering if your ministry has had any communications directly with CN Rail and or been working with other ministries such as Ministry of Transportation Infrastructure to lobby and provide pressure and come to the table with some funds, because we've already got the federal government who's come forward and said they're willing to contribute a significant amount of money to upgrading the spur line from Fort St. John to Fort Nelson. Industries on board. We've got the First Nation, Fort Nelson First Nations on board, Northern Rockies regional municipalities on board. Seems like everybody's at the table but the province. So, the economical viability for our province, for that community, depends on the railway. It is such an important component of any kind of return to, any viability. So just wonder if the minister can shed some light on that.
Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you. The member referred to a spur line. Surely the member means a main line between Fort St. John and Fort Nelson. So I think that's important to correct for the record. And I think I can't resist saying this, and you know what I'm going to say, is that I find it somewhat ironic that the member is a member of a party who sold the railroad that was once under provincial ownership, and we would have a lot more flexibility of management regime if we owned the rail line. Although probably it's unfair to say sold it. They only leased the track for 999 years to another party. So forgive me for rising to the bait there. I felt that I really had to point that out to the member. But now to get to the point. There is no doubt that rail access to Fort Nelson is crucial. I think the speed limit on the track is down at 30 miles an hour. It's built I understand, in a very unsatisfactory manner, and the foundation of the rail bed is shaky at best. It would require a major investment. And I think that's Brian Fair, who had, I think, bought what were the Canfor tenures in Fort Nelson. Canfor didn't log them. He bought them. He had a proposal for a bioenergy plant, and he made some representations on this very issue. But what we have done as a government is made a 10-year offer. Should the rail problems, or when the rail problems are resolved, we made a 10-year offer to the Fort Nelson First Nation. And it's a very substantive one, that if the rail access issue is solved and it becomes economically viable to operate, then the Fort Nelson First Nation would have tenure that they could mobilize as an economic asset and make a viable business there. So I think Mr. Fair's proposal was something to do with biomass for hydrogen production. I'm not sure what the status is of that, but certainly there is economic potential in that part of the riding. Together with the Fort Nelson First Nation, I think we've realized what the potential is. We are enthusiastic about that, but it's really to CN to resolve that issue. And certainly we have supported the industry who has made the representations to CN. We have not been directly at the table with CN, but certainly I take the member's point about the economic potential of the region.
Member.
Thanks, Chair. And I guess the minister, obviously I appreciate him recognizing the need for the rail line for the recovery of Fort Nelson, and there are so many potentials up there, and I understand that this is forestry, but the mining potential, the natural gas potential, forestry potential, which is really important, and Brian Fair, Peak Renewables, is making some investments up there, and others want to make investments up there, but and in forestry. But the one thing holding everyone back is the rail line, not spur, and that is correct. It the main line between Fort St. John and Fort Nelson. But at the end of the day, I mean, BC Rail still does own the track. It's just the operations of it is now CN, which. We can talk about that later over a cup of coffee, but we do need the province to come forth and potentially, well, not potentially, but to sit down and have these conversations as a viable partner, and I guess that's what I do ask the minister to take back, to his colleagues and within his office to move forward. So more of a statement than anything, just a follow up on that. My final question, though. Does somewhat tie into the previous one, is around Donnie Creek. Donnie Creek was a significant fire. It's still burning as we speak. It hasn't gone out. Smoldered all winter long in the muskeg. And I'm just wondering two pieces. Number one is there a plan before the wildfire season starts up to do some early engagement on those fires to bring them under control before they spark up and we have the whole Northeast under flames again? And two, where it ties in with the the spur line, or spur line, man, I gotta quit saying that. The main line, the peak renewables, is the wood that burnt last year, and there's a lot of it. What is being done to make sure that it can be salvaged? It's got about another year and a little bit left before it's kind of useless. So time is of the essence to make sure that that wood is used in some way that that not only the community can benefit, but the province can benefit from it.
Minister.
Thank you. So two-part answer. First, on the question about what has been done to monitor the ongoing potential fire threat. The Prince George Fire Center has satellite monitoring. The resolution is fine enough to detect movement or growth in any of those fires. Generally, they're within what's called the burned area, and so if they flare up within that area and they're no danger, there's no action taken. But if there is a concern that the fire might take off again, as it did last year, then the Prince George Fire Center and the early attack crews, they're all ready to go if that's required. On the wire, so that the safety aspect of that is being taken care of, but there's no plan to extinguish the holdover fires, or sometimes they're called zombie fires, the ones that are burning underground, unless they flare up and pose a danger to people or property or infrastructure in the area. And so secondly, on the wildfire salvage and the opportunities, the beginning in October, wildfire salvage opportunity agreements were issued to members to the Treaty 8 First Nations. They've issued a total of 700,000 cubic meters of permits for cutting. Now, the work has started. Obviously, they haven't done all of that, and that would be a longer project. But they are working right away on that. The necessary rehabilitation and recovery work has been done, and the ability to salvage and take that burned wood to either to mills in Fort St. John or even as far as Chetwynd is what the anticipated goal of those salvage operations is. So work is underway and the public is being protected.
Recognizing the member from Kootenay East.
Well, thanks, Chair, and thanks to my colleague from Peace River South for giving me some time, and the Minister, of course, for hopefully acting on a humble request that I have here today, and it's in regards to the McDonald Ranch and Lumber, and I see some smiles across, and the Minister may know that from his former file. This ranch has been around for well over 100 years, and when I say well over 100 years, they had their 100th anniversary last year. But they have been a mainstay in the region. They generate their own electricity. They had one of the first EPAs, and obviously they had some lumber operations there as well. They still do. They were part of the operating service area for a considerable amount of time, and then back when the BC Timber Sales came into B, they were part of the small business program, and during that shuffle, they lost their operating service area license. And I think at that time it was relayed to them that, work with Crestbrook, I think it was at the time. Galloway Lumber was in the area that had some operating areas. And it somewhat worked. I think they had some good relationships with Galloway, but not so much with the bigger operations such as Crestbrook, Tembec, and now Canfor. And so now with Galloway basically giving out to Canfor right now, they're finding themselves in a pretty bad situation where they won't have any available timber. So I think it was a bit of an oversight over the years, and the operator has been able to piecemeal it together to some degree. Unfortunately, it seems now that it's the end of the road for them, and they want the ministry just to kind of follow up on the commitment that was made 20, 30 years ago, and to bring home to them some sort of certainty about their future. And so the request to the minister is to take a look at their request. I think it's it's arguably a good one, and I'd like to know the minister's response.
Minister.
Before attempting an answer, perhaps the member could just clarify what the specific proposal is. I guess I'm not sure if there's a specialty cutter in the area or what exactly the proposal is. It'll be helpful for the staff to be able to assist me with the response if I have a better idea of what the proposal is.
Member.
Well, thanks. Well, I think the request is in order to operate with a license, they need an operating area to work in. So they're requesting to have their operations included in their own operating service area.
Minister.
Thank you. What the staff told me is that the BC Timber Sales program will reach out to the entity that you speak of, McDonald Ranch and Timber, and attempt to find a niche for them within the programs that are available. So, and perhaps some dialogue between the staff and the member in order to make the appropriate contacts would be helpful.
Recognizing the member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to ask a few questions back on forest fires, and for a few moments before I turn it over to my colleague from Prince George Mackenzie, we'll have some questions. But it did get touched on, so I think maybe we'll just stay on that train for a minute. Can the minister, maybe just for the record, I know we've talked about it a little bit, but can the minister talk about the final budget numbers from last year, what the cost was for all the firefighting? I know the minister and we've all talked about how last year was an unprecedented year. There was a lot of work that went into fire, I'd like to say mitigation, but we'll say reactionary programs to the forest fires. Maybe with that would also add what's in the budget this year, and then maybe we'll explore it further after that. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you. The financial year end, as the member knows, is March 31st. So the final number for this past fire season has not yet been arrived. It's estimated, I think, and it's been publicly reported to be approximately slightly over $1 billion. I can give the member some of the flavor of that, about the coming season. The amount in the I just need the other number there. Yes, there we are. The dollar value in what's called the fire management vote is $232,736,000. So that's the number in the budget. But under the Wildfire Act, there is access in the event of needing more, and that certainly was the case last year, which is essentially, one hesitates to say unlimited because there's a limit to everything, but can exceed far beyond the 232 million that's in the budget. So, and that's exactly what happened last year. For the prospective 2024 season, there's an operating increase of 18.530 million to secure additional aviation resources, including increased helicopter and air tanker availability. Increased in staffing resources. There'll be an increase of 9 million in 24-25 and 14 million in the following year. Ongoing staff resources for structure protection, prevention and risk reduction, wildland fire-based recovery. So about approximately 76 positions and other frontline staff. Capital of 20.7 million in 24-25 to construct a new equipment depot and complete a capital plan. So that's some of the sense of the potential or the budgeted increases for the wildfire service for the coming season.
Member.
Thank you. So when we're looking at those, I'm just curious, for quite a few years now, obviously, as we look at climate change and some of the impacts we've had within our province around every year, fires seem getting worse and worse, but the budget goes up just a little bit, and then we always have to go to reserves or whatever. How do we land, how does the ministry land at the request for budget allocation for fire management? Because obviously we've seen almost every year we're very low compared to what we actually need. So is it the thought or process through that budget management that let's just use what we have and then just go to reserves if needed because we don't want to pad a budget and then not use it? Like, I'm just curious what the thought process is there when we know that typically, of course we always knock on wood that it's not going to be a bad year, but typically every year we go over budget with that allotment that's given to the ministry. So what's the process for determination?
Minister.
Thank you. The budgeting process is this. There is a fixed cost that's estimated. So that's the $232 million, and that's based on anticipated costs. And then, depending on the season, there are the variable costs, which in this particular season, last season, soared to over $1 billion. But it is, I think we sometimes forget when we go back and look at previous years, and they provided me with some figures. For example, in 2020, there were 670 total fires and a total cost of $193 million spent. In 2019, 825 fires for a total of $182.5 million. So 2021 was 1,647 and an expenditure of $718 million. So dramatic fluctuations, obviously, depending on the year. I think we tend to drive out of our memory the low impact years and remember more vividly the high impact years, and I think that's probably just not any surprise. Back in 2013, the total cost was $122 million. So the number of fires can fluctuate, although what we are anticipating, and on behalf of the, if I'm going to use the collective voice of BC Wildfire Service, and certainly the Premier has expressed his concern, because I think this is the public concern, is given what's happened last year and what the trends are and what we saw across North America and in Europe and in the Southern Hemisphere in the opposite season, is climate change is bringing about longer fires, more intense fires, the season beginning earlier and ending later. And in the case of British Columbia here, we've seen some of those fires that have basically continued underground in the muskeg in the Northeast right through the winter. So the long-term spending trend is to prepare more thoroughly. We've hired more people. We have more equipment available. The Premier designated a wildfire and all hazards task force that looked into the previous season with focus on a number of items. The report is about to be released. It hasn't been released yet, but certainly there were a number of specific concerns that were addressed, but the basic focus is these were concerns and problems in the last season. How can we do better? For example, evacuations. That falls under my colleague, the Minister of Emergency Services, and she will address those in her estimates. But how can we do the evacuation process in a more efficient, effective way? There was an integration that took place in a practical sense between what they call structural firefighters, municipal firefighters, and wildland firefighters, and West Kelowna was probably the example of where those two streams of firefighting work very effectively together. How can we understand that better, formalize it, and move forward and be prepared for similar occurrences in the coming season? So the focus of the Premier's task force was not a Royal Commission style event where they take some time to digest and produce recommendations. It was producing recommendations as it went along, and those recommendations are intended to be enacted and fully implemented in the upcoming season. So it's the people who participated in the process described it as an unusually effective process in the sense of recommendations. There's a broad committee that from the community and stakeholders that led the inquiry, and the recommendations are, I think, actionable and will be implemented for the coming season. Public safety is obviously paramount, and so I think we've hit on a pretty effective formula. One can't prepare for every contingency, but certainly many of the challenges that we saw in the last fire season and a series of evacuations were addressed, and there will be improvements forthcoming in anticipation what many think may be a tough fire season ahead.
Member
Thank you. Also want to make sure I think the minister knows from our position, even his, of course, we want to make sure that not only just the budget is one thing, but making sure that the resources are there in the time of crisis. And we all, I think, understand and support the fact that extra funds are needed outside of that. It's more of the budgeting process I was curious on, so appreciate the minister's answer. I also want to acknowledge this. So the minister kind of bridged to the expert task force that the premier put together around wildfires, floods, drought. I can't remember exactly what the other ones that he added into that, and I looked at that. I think that was early September of last year when that was announced, and there was quite a extensive list of experts that were put onto that, which was great to see. The minister just alluded to that and that it would be coming soon. Does he have any more information on that? Because that was kind of, I was waiting to hear maybe on that, because we don't want to wait, as the minister said, when you have other panels that can take a couple of years. I think the thought process was, how do we expedite some decision making and some ideas, which completely support. So we are getting close to, unfortunately, already starting to hear about some forest fires that are happening around the province. I just had one in my community region just a couple of weeks ago. So with that task force, is there a definitive end date that they were given, maybe under terms of reference? Will the recommendations be public, and is that something we can expect soon?
Minister.
Thank you very much. The terms of reference of the task force meant that it wrapped up all the evidence taking and is concluded. The recommendations are being made final, and I can't scoop the premier on this, of course, but the recommendations will become public in a couple of weeks. I would say towards the end of the month or early next month. But along the way, to give an example of some of the changes that have been implemented, recommendations that have already been implemented. One is recruitment to the BC Wildfire Service. The recommendation was that the recruitment period was fairly focused over a 1 month, 45-day period. It's basically commenced in October and is concluded in March. Unprecedented interest in the number of applications, I think essentially doubled. from to about, I think, 1,800 applications, so increased interest in participating. We've also had a couple of boot camps for First Nations potential recruits, one in the Caribou and one in Pemberton prior to the recruitment process opening up. So there are those changes that have already, those are examples of the task force making recommendations and them being implemented before the report has come out as a final report. So it is an ongoing track, and but the conclusion of the process in the public sense is coming very, very soon. And I agree with you that we want to be ready for the season, and the group has worked very, very intensively to be ready so that those recommendations that they have will be implemented or implementable for the season to come.
Member.
Thank you. Maybe first my acknowledgement will be that it was very wise of the minister not to scoop the premier. As a former minister, I know how career limiting that could be if you do that. So wise move on his part there. But you know, I've had the privilege of meeting with a lot of the firefighters, as I know the minister has as well. And the work they do is absolutely incredible under stressful situations, long hours. You know, we hear the stories of the work that they do, which leads me to maybe a quick question that I have. And the minister, I'll have to coin the phrase that the Minister of Health always uses, the minister obviously will know that the District of Chetwynd has written to him in the last month or so. I know I've written to the minister as well, District of Hudson's Hope, and my colleague from Peace River North is also hearing, and this is around the initial fire attack crews and the locations of them. So we did have a small group that was located in Chetwynd, and the mayor and council of Chetwynd and Hudson's Hope as well have reached out to us as local MLAs with concerns that they've been relocated, I believe, to Dawson Creek, who has a larger center. But I think as the minister can appreciate the concerns that local government and citizens have, especially in light of not only last year provincially being an incredible negative impact on the forest fires, but we had a lot of local ones as well. So the ask, and I talked with mayor and council, and they regrettably had to tell me that they still have not heard back from the minister or his office from about 3 months ago, I think, or 2 months ago. And so they're worried going into this season that they haven't heard back, and hoping that the ministry through their different branches will reconsider those changes, because you know, an hour drive can make a huge difference. As the minister knows, fires can double in size quickly in half an hour. So you know, that impact is really important. So I believe the minister or his staff will be aware of this. Can he give me maybe why that change was made and if it can be reconsidered?
Minister.
Oh, thank you. That's a new chair. So there is currently a forwarded TAC base at Chetwynd. There are 2 crews of 4 persons each. They're housed have been in a fairly outdated facility, trailers. So the intention is that there be a triple wide trailer that would replace the existing trailers, because the one that is there, I'm told, or is not really suitable for human habitation. Those crews would be moved to Dawson Creek, but in the time when a fire hazard were to rise, then they would be transferred to Chetwynd as a forward, and use it as a forward attack base during times of heightened fire alert. I'm told that by helicopter it's about 20 minutes from Dawson to the Chetwynd Airport, and so they could be there very quickly. So that's the provisional plan that's been made for the coming season.
Member.
Hi, Chair. Welcome to the Chair. It's great to see we're recognizing Casual Friday already on a Wednesday afternoon. Appreciate the Minister's answer. I mean, I think from a local perspective, I think he has to appreciate, though, yes, it is, because I've done it many times, it is around 20 minutes by helicopter. If you can get one, because they're mostly staged up in Fort St. John. We don't have a helicopter base permanent in Dawson Creek that I am told. So just to put that in perspective. So listening to the Minister's answer, though, the concern, and maybe I'll take some positives out of the Minister's, not to put words in his mouth, but said when we get to a high risk that these members will be moved back to Chetwynd. Does that mean we actually wait until there's a fire, or do we wait until a high risk time? Because, and how do we constitute high risk? Is this by the usual Ministry of Forest determination of risk value on the landscape due to drought and temperature? Or the reason why I say is, as I said in my first commentary, we had a fire just 2 weeks ago. So we're already in drought. The city of Dawson Creek is already on water restrictions because of the drought. We had very little snowpack. In fact, we're already, some would say they like this, we're supposed to be plus 15, 16 in Dawson Creek starting next week. So we're already in a drought situation going into high temperatures. So I'm flagging that for the minister, but I'm just curious if I understood him correctly, because if we're getting into already a high-risk season, when will those people be moved back to the Chetwynd area?
Minister.
Thank you. I wanted to just reassure the member and perhaps the citizens of Chetwynd and the Mayor and Council of Chetwynd. The decisions on the allocation of resources is made by people in the Prince George office based on what they call weather, indices, probability. There's a matrix called the Canadian Wildland Fire Danger Rating System, and there is the input of a local zone officer as well. Again, these are experienced people, and so it's not a question of waiting until a fire breaks out, as the minister suggested, or the members suggested as an alternative. It's waiting for an analysis based on a series of data and judgment by experienced people in the field that would determine the decision to allocate resources throughout the region, and in this case to Chetwynd if required.
Member.
Thanks, Chair. I guess my only follow-up to that, appreciate that. Could I ask, rather than myself paraphrasing or printing off the blues, could I respectfully ask then that the minister asks for his staff to respond with to the mayor and council to their letter? I just found it here. It was January 12th that they sent a letter off to the ministry. And if they could respond with kind of the information that was shared here, just to help put them at ease, as the minister knows how some of this stuff can spread. It would be nice to be able to have the people who have the concern who be able to share that with the community before social media and others spread it out. That's not factual. So if I can ask for that commitment, that would be excellent.
Minister.
Certainly, I've met the mayor of Chetwynd on a number of occasions, and certainly we can commit to do that, and perhaps I can give him a call as well.
Member for Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. I got a couple of areas I want to explore this afternoon. One dealing with the loss of wildlife and biodiversity associated with forestry, but the first one I'll talk about is sort of blends in with what our discussion has been with respect to hydrology and fires and whatnot. And it's my preamble might be a little bit long here just to try and set the stage where I'm coming from. Probably more. Yes, no, I understand that. So, yeah, I'll make sure that I'm within my allotted time limit.
Just that's not supposed to happen,
Chair.
So that's okay. I forgive you. Go ahead, man.
So basically, I go back and when the Premier back in 2014 appointed me Parliamentary Secretary to Forest to look at biodiversity and wildlife habitat in the province. Of course, it was right up my alley. I had an intense interest in that. But after a couple of years, I also started looking at the hydrological impacts to the watersheds in British Columbia. And the one that caught my attention first was the Chilako River within my riding, and a number of farmers coming to me concerned over the spring freshets washing property away and destroying private bridges. And when I looked into that, I became aware of the provincial equivalent clear-cut area policies. It's extension note 118 that was put out. And it states that the community watersheds, there can be an equivalent clear-cut area of 20%, fishery-sensitive watersheds 25%, and other watersheds 30%. And so I took note of that, and I found a report done by a private consultant in the early 2000s that indicated that I think it was by 2013, the Chilako River watershed had an ECA of about 80%. And so I looked into that, and I was dealing with the licensee at the time, Canfor, and the complaints from citizens, and I was trying to arrange a meeting. So I confronted Canfor with this information, and I said, here's what I have, is this ECA for the Chilako watershed is at 80%. It's a fishery-sensitive watershed. The Chinook population had been counted in the thousands prior to 2000, and after that it had dwindled until we had single-digit numbers in the salmon counts. So to me, that it's a fishery-sensitive watershed as well. Canfor came back and they said, yeah, we agree, we've done our own calculations on that, and we agree with that number, it's 80%. So we had a meeting and we discussed, there was a couple of areas that they were going to be cutting that had already been approved by forestry and government. And they did indeed cut those particular areas, which increased the ECA for that area. But I started looking at other areas. I looked at the Parsnip River, I looked at the Anzac River, the Table River, a lot of the watersheds within my riding, and they didn't conform with the instructions that were written in the Extension Note 118. And I perused them all, looked at them all, and then I came across a Forest Practices Board report from 2016 that highlighted some research that had been done that indicated that the loss of the forest canopy was contributing to the frequency and magnitude of floods in the province. And it also said in that particular report that, and I'm paraphrasing here going from memory, that it took, and this study was done, there was a series of studies done in the southern interior, but it took 80 years for a conifer tree to grow to a sufficient height where it started providing the same level of protection from the sun's radiation that the original forest may have had. And if that was 80 years in the southern interior, I thought, my goodness, it's got to be 100 years or more in the central interior and the higher elevations that we see up in my particular riding. But I went into those studies that were highlighted in this 2016 report, and there was a series of them that had taken place into the early 2000s, and a number of them since that were verifying this information. Until a report came out in 2022, I believe, that basically confirmed that the loss of forest cover was indeed connected to the frequency and magnitude of flooding in the province. And it was followed up by a recent science report that came out in December of 2023. Eunice Alila and I forgot the other gentleman researcher that was involved in that one. Both UBC, Eunice Alila is a UBC professor of hydrology. And he conclusively stated that the loss of the forest canopy is the cause of the increased frequency and of floods and magnitude of the floods in the province. So this struck my attention because here we see loss of life associated to flooding in the province. We see billions of dollars of infrastructure damage resulting in the province, in the interior, around the Merritt area, the Nicola Valley, in the Lower Mainland, in the Quesnel area. We just had $1 billion given to the province through the financial disaster assistance to pay for roads, the secondary road infrastructure that was damaged from mudslides and whatnot associated to the loss of forest cover. So my question to the minister is, how has the ministry, what has the ministry done with that information? It's 20-year-old research that has finally culminated in that final report from December 2023, which to me is, you know, as a former superintendent in the RCMP, I had to pay attention to the case law that dictated how we did our investigations, how we handle our evidence, and all those other things in order to comply. And that's what I see this science doing. There's about a dozen or more studies that we should be adjusting how we approach forestry as a result of that. But I also had concerns that when I looked at the clear cutting in British Columbia that we've done since the 1960s, you know, that's not that long ago. So none of the forests that we see in British Columbia have recovered to the point where they can start providing the same level of protection from the sun's radiation that this science says is required, these 80-year trees. We're cutting trees, you know, a lot of secondary forests are being cut right now, but none of these forests have recovered. So I think the clear and present danger facing British Columbia is the risk of floods. And this paper that says that the loss of canopy is causing these floods. And then subsequent to that, with the loss of the canopy, the spring freshets flowing and flushing all the moisture out of the ground. And over the summer months, these watersheds are drying out because there's no forest cover for them. then we see a heightened risk of wildfire as a result of that. And compounding that, we have the forest plantations, the silviculture practices over the last number of years, now decades, where we're planting monoculture conifer plantations at 1,500 to 3,000 stems per hectare, and more when you see a lot of the natural regen coming into those growths as well, that it's a volatile situation. So I'm curious as to what the ministry is doing about this, whether there's been instruction to the chief forester to include this science into their calculations for the AACs, and whether the AACs are going to be significantly impacted by this on an urgent basis because of the dangers that these floods and fires present to British Columbians.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I want to begin by thanking the member for an interesting and challenging question. What he refers to as the ECA is the acronym for Equivalent Clear-Cut Area, and the 80% is indeed the target in the normal times. But what, and I think he knows this well, is that within the Prince George region, the pine forests of the Prince George region, they've been subject to the pine beetle and the spruce beetle, but particularly pine beetle, within the harvesting base as of the fall of 2017. So there's 731 million cubic meters of suffered red and gray attack. It's about 54% of the total pine volume on the timber harvesting land base. So then there's a further estimate of 735 million cubic meters of pine volume on the timber harvesting base will be killed. So that has led to decisions to go beyond the 80% ECA, given the need to harvest and extirpate the beetle and begin a replanting process that removes those very damaged stands. So the follow-on consequence of that is a robust plan of silviculture, and so the provincial silviculture program has planted an average of 278 million trees annually over the last 10 years. In 3 occasions since 2017 fires, there's been over 300 million trees planted. So the idea is, and the way to revive and meet the concerns about the hydrology is to replant and to regrow the forest in a way that would address those hydrological issues. As the member knows, that's not done overnight, but that's the direction that is being taken. The province has partnerships with the federal government, 2 Billion Trees program, Clean BC through the Forest Investment Program, and also the province has funded silviculture research through a new institute in Smithers that's going to look at the best ways to engage in silviculture. The Chief Forester does take account, here I've just got a quick note here, does incorporate the best forest science into the decisions that he makes. So the way to deal with the hydrological issues that the member mentions is by prompt and extensive and intensive to replanting in the dimensions and the numbers that are being done.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. To the Minister, a little alarmed by his answer. That 80% is the target, and it's even higher for ECAs through the central interior and the pine-dominated areas, perhaps. I go back, and I've been aware and involved in these kinds of things now for quite some time, and I recall when the pine beetle was at its height in the Prince George Timber Supply area and throughout the province, that the Prince George district manager put a soft partition in place saying, forest companies, concentrate on the pine. And the entire Prince George Timber Supply area will have up to a maximum of 800,000 cubic meters can be greenwood, and the rest has to be the dead pine. But that was for all the operators in the area. And what happened is each of the licensees took 800,000 cubic meters of wood. And instead of there was a lot of dead pine that was taken, but there was a lot of the midterm timber supply that was taken as well. And I brought this up in a presentation I made to the Council of Forest Industries in 2015. Said, you guys are cutting down your midterm timber supply, and we will be out of harvestable wood within the next 8 to 10 years if this rate carries on the way we have. And I understand, the method, the foresters at the time thought eliminating all the dead pine, and I've heard the forest companies use the term sanitizing the forests from these terrible bugs that are there. That's a misconception for the public. I think they get the wrong idea from that. Pests are a natural reality in our forests, and they have been since time began. But it was devastating on the pine beetle. And if 80% ECA is the norm, I shudder to think about the consequences when I look at the 20 years of research from the University of BC Hydrology Department. But most of my area is predominantly spruce and balsam. And a lot of that spruce and balsam, there was some mixed pine in the areas as well. The spruce beetle came along and has destroyed a lot of the spruce forest that is throughout the Dominica. But the spruce doesn't last as long, so we don't see that vim and vigor going in there and cutting it down to the extent that we saw the pine trees, because the pine will last 20 years. In fact, there's dead pine standing today that is still a quality saw log. The spruce doesn't last that long. But I'm concerned, that we see forestry taking advantage of the pine beetle as a reason to cut everything down, to sanitize our forest. In actual term, a better term would be to sterilize our forests as a result of that. And this will lead into my next round of questioning, but the question I pose to the minister now is, how did we let it get to this 80% ECA over these vast thousands and thousands of hectares of clear cut in the last 20 years, when science, this science that I talked about earlier, has been, presented these issues as a clear and present concern 20 years ago. And they have been building on those initial outcomes from those researchers taking place throughout the province, to the point where they conclusively say now today that has caused the floods. We're downhill. I live, half of my riding is in the Arctic watershed, the other half is in the Pacific watershed. And when everything goes array and these clear cuts that are now happening in the upper reaches of the Fraser Basin and the upper reaches of all the watersheds in BC flood, it goes downstream. And the people in Abbotsford will see the results of that taking place. When we see the Coldwater River, which has been severely over-harvested as well, doing the same thing. And I think Merritt sees the result of that. Is the minister not concerned of some liability being exposed to the province, or the province being exposed to this liability, because we are still continuing, now that we know the cause, we are still continuing to harvest at the same rate, and we are diminishing the overall canopy that we have, and it's going to add to the situation that we see with floods and fires in the future.
Minister?
Thank you, Member. A couple of points that emerged during our discussions here in an effort to answer the member's question. The ECA of 80% was elevated during the time of the pine beetle and the spruce beetle. What the normal target is, and the target now is 20 to 30% ECA. So I think I may have left a misleading impression with the member in my earlier answer. The other point that I would make would be that given that the impact of the pine and the spruce beetle and killing those trees, even if there was no harvest, they would still have the same hydrological impact because dead trees do not absorb water. So the effort and the policy back in sort of post-2015 in that region that the member mentioned was to stop the beetle and capture the value and create the jobs that came from that. So that was the ethic at that time. But the AAC has come down, the annual allowable cut set by the Chief Forester has come down dramatically as a result of the pine beetle, as a result of the fires. And in fact, last season, the 2.3 million hectares burned far exceeds the area that's been harvested in the entire province. There's about 95 million hectares in the entire province, and 2.3 million hectares was the subject and burned to some degree or another last summer. So and that has the same potential hydrological impacts that the member referred to. So the challenge is, and the AAC, just given all those factors and the best science that is being applied by the Chief Forester, is at least 40% lower than it was beginning. It's come down over the period 2011 to 2021, 40%, and it will continue to decline. Indeed, that's the subject of some concern by the industry about the harvestable area. It is declining. I think what is looked for in the economic side is some stability and predictability as to where harvesting opportunities will continue to exist. But some of the concerns that the member raised, and I'm not dismissing them in any way, are mitigated by the fact that the future in terms of the harvesting areas is much reduced from what it was during the height of the logging that was dealing with the consequences of the beetle infestation.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the Minister's answer, and it's a good segue into the second part of my question. But I just want to comment here when he talks about the equivalent clear-cut area being extended to 80% because of the pine beetle and spruce beetle that we see, and has dropped now down to 20-30% on average across the province. And the fact that the pine beetle did have implications on the hydrology of the land, it did for sure. I can attest to that. Operating my trap line during that period of time, the ground never dried out. It was standing water in the ground, and the pine trees were dead. But the mixed spruce that was in the area as well would loosen up because they're shallow roots, and the wind would blow them down. And that, of course, attracts the spruce beetle and with these down trees. So it was a significant problem. But it was exacerbated by the clear-cut strategy, in my humble opinion. And I think others share that as well. When we see vast areas of clear-cuts, and there's one in my riding right now that is over 3,000 hectares in size, that was harvested in the Carey Lake area, we see vast areas that have been clear-cut of everything. Not just the dead pine or the dead spruce, but the balsam, the birch, the poplar, all the deciduous growth that is in there as well. And that is having further impacts on not only the hydrology on the land, but the biodiversity that's on the land base as well. There's 81 species of wildlife that den or nest in tree cavities in British Columbia. And when we eliminate all of those tree cavities, we eliminate those species from that area. And we've seen regional extirpation of a lot of these species as a result of this. So between the clear cutting impacts on hydrology, the clear cutting has had significant impacts on the wildlife populations in the province. Looking at the statistical data over the last 40, 50 years, you know, I look at moose for an example, their populations have dropped significantly in the Dominica. When I look at raptors like goshawks, I don't see goshawks anymore in the Dominica region, and they used to be prolific. They were there all the time. Great horned owls, the great gray owls, and I don't see any of those animals in the forest, in the Dominica region. I went so far as to driving around the Prince George Timber Supply, the Quesnel Timber Supply area, Lakes District Supply area, purposefully looking for stick nests that these goshawks and these owls would inhabit. And I couldn't find any. And under Section 34 of the Wildlife Act, it's illegal to cut down a stick nest at any time, period. And there was a requirement for, and I walked into I put 15,000 kilometers on my truck driving into these areas. I used binoculars, I walked in and looked at areas that I couldn't get a good look at, and I couldn't find a one. And I found that astounding, being the fact that a lot of these areas had large populations of goshawk and owls and other raptors in the area, let alone fur bears. The marten population, I find a report from 1986 that was done by Fish and Wildlife Branch on marten densities in British Columbia, and a fairly lengthy report. The bibliography attached to that report is 10 pages long. And I picked maybe a dozen or 15 studies that the bibliography referred to, and every single one of them talked about the impacts that harvesting and clear cuts had on marten populations. The Dominica region had some of the densest marten populations in all of British Columbia. They're basically gone. I hardly see a marten anywhere, and they were prolific at one particular time. Same with a fisher. So there's been all kinds of indicators that government should have been monitoring and looking at over the last 50 years that indicate the impacts of clear cutting on wildlife populations. And when we see this 50% decline in wildlife populations in the last 50 years, in some cases we see regional extirpation, so 100% of the species is gone from some of these areas, that's a concern for me. So recently it was brought to my attention, there was a goshawk study being done in the Morris River area out of Houston that indicated that, so it was a study that was conducted by a professional wildlife biologist, a forester, and another expert in the field. And it was funded by Canfor. They graciously funded this particular study. But it indicated that goshawks need about 44,500 hectares of primary forest to support one goshawk colony. And a goshawk colony is the male, female, and the nestlings from that particular year. The study indicated that there's only 35 colonies left in the entire area out of approximately 450. And that's a concern for me. So it's my understanding that a copy of this report was forwarded to the Chief Forester and to the Regional Executive Director for that particular region up there for their comment and advice. And these researchers provided some advice on how we move forward from this. The comment that I understand came back from one of those offices was it's got too big of an economic impact on our forest operations, therefore we're not going to consider it. I find that fascinating, that we would not consider the fact that we would go all out and extirpate wildlife populations from British Columbia in favor of a tree that will take 200 or 300 years to grow back to the point where it will provide the same kind of habitat. So the question to the minister is, when we look at the hydrological science that has come out from UBC, when we look at all of the data and all the warning signals from the wildlife biologists on fur bearers, on raptors, on ungulates, on salmon, on other species that we have here, saying that the loss of forest cover is contributing to the degradation of this habitat and it's impacting these populations. So what is the ministry doing about that today? And how are we going to move forward so that we start reestablishing the biodiversity and the habitat necessary to support robust populations of all these species of wildlife that we have in the province, and at the same time trying to restore the hydrological integrity of the watersheds that we have in British Columbia to keep British Columbians safe?
Members, we'll take a brief recess. And before we do, I should just like to clarify the controversial comments made by the member for Peace River South regarding my attire. And I'd just like to quote from the report of the acting clerk to the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, Dress Guidelines and Expectations of the Parliament Buildings 2019, paragraph 6. Men may wear contemporary business attire and neckties are not required. So for the edification of those watching, and indeed for those members present, the dress code clarification has occurred, and we will recess until 5 after the hour. Thank you. Members, we'll call the Committee of Supply Section A back to order. We're currently considering the estimates of the Ministry of Forests. And I believe the Minister has a response to the previous question. Minister, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that clarification on the dress code. I appreciate that, although I'm not going to follow your lead. So the question of the member is essentially, given what he's spoken about, what are we doing to change forest management and forest practices? So I think I would start with the Old Growth Strategic Review, which has produced 14 recommendations, commissioned and written by Al Gorley and Gary Merkel. And we've adopted all 14 of those recommendations. So there are a number of specific recommendations in there that address some of the concerns that are raised. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the conservation fund that was established. The $300 million in First Nations-led conservation fund in partnership with BC Parks was announced by the Premier and by Minister Wilkinson federally not so long ago. And there's a promise of more private sector philanthropic money to expand that money for conservation areas. So one of the directors of I think it's Ken Wu, the executive director of the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance, said, the Premier has delivered. This is a huge conservation victory for many thousands of people who've spoken up for this for years. One of the other steps in the Old Growth Strategic Review, recommendation number 6, was the deferral process, and that has largely been worked through the system, but those are steps to conserve forests, in particular the oldest and rarest ones. Another innovation, and there's money in the budget previously, and there's further money in the budget this year, is putting communities together through new forest landscape planning tables, which will address the very values that the member spoke of: wildlife values, biodiversity, hydrology, river systems, to drive improved forest management and incorporate local knowledge and community priorities. As I've said, we're investing in improving silviculture practices to support alternatives to clear cutting. We're updating laws and regulations to embed ecosystem health in forest decisions. And so balance that on the other side with a new BC Manufacturing Jobs Fund to support more sustainable jobs, invest in ongoing manufacturing operations where the infusion of fresh capital for new equipment will assist there. We've also developed the value-added category, which will provide a certain percentage of, beginning at 10%, of BC timber sales to a separate category of smaller producers who are qualify for as value-added producers, that they will be able to bid on the auctions, and them only on those auctions, and have timber for their ongoing operations. That's the intention is, and the ambition is to expand that program, but it's certainly up and running, very well received by the value-added sector. So what we are striving for in the change that we brought about is a different approach to forest management. And in the era of wildfires and the pine beetle, there are certainly, it's required. And I think our public demands a change in forest management. And I think some of the views that the member has expressed are views that are shared not by the whole population, not by everyone in resource communities. Certainly I acknowledge that, and I spoke to forest workers and their representatives just yesterday. So there's certainly a diversity of opinion on this issue, but within the Old Growth Strategic Review, there is room for conservation areas and areas of intense economic harvesting activity. And the challenge which will be met through the forest landscape planning process, is to bring those views together and make decisions on a regional basis about where harvesting activity will take place and areas that will be conserved. So I hope that provides some comfort to the member.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. It raises more concern. I didn't hear much urgency in there with respect to the impact of the hydrological studies on how we do forestry in British Columbia. But, the minister spoke about the strategic review and the deferrals of old growth, the valuable trees that are so necessary to preserve the biodiversity that we have in the province. And of course, there's some controversy out right now about the boundaries of the deferral area being moved, and now including other forests that, in my experience and observations over the years, the forest companies wouldn't be looking at, other than the fact that we're out of wood today, because it's high elevation, low volume, low value wood that, for the most part, they're not getting very many saw logs out of it, particularly when some of it's impacted by the spruce beetle. But it's high elevation, low volume wood that would have been ignored 20 years ago by industry. I heard the minister today speak in question period in an answer talking about, the saw logs would be separated and any of the low volume wood that the licensees would take in these deferral areas would be diverted to pellets or to bioenergy or to the pulp sector, depending on the quality of the wood. It's still clear cutting, and I've driven into these clear cuts, and it's still clear cutting in a significant way. But I want to ask the minister, what value does the minister or the ministry place upon biodiversity on the wood that they call low value? They cut it all down. Some of it's probably tree cavities for one of the 81 species that we have. But how do they determine the low value of this wood? Is it based on solely the value to the forest sector, to 2x4s or pulpwood or the pellet industry? Or do they include the value of evapotranspiration, value of habitat for the wildlife that are there? What's wrong with leaving that so-called low-value wood standing where it is, instead of cutting it all down and shipping it all to Scotland or to Europe in the form of pellets when we wipe out the biodiversity that's on the ground? And I'll finish up with this as part of this question. Somebody once asked me, and I put the question out to them as well, what happens to the wildlife that's in an area that is being harvested? And I said, well, they die. The wildlife dies. And they kind of look at me and they say, well, don't they scamper off and run and hide in the surrounding area? And I said, there's 81 species of wildlife that den or nest in these tree cavities, and a lot of them are crushed and killed in the logging exercise by itself. The ones that are lucky enough to escape that kind of an unfortunate demise will either go into an adjacent forest that might be close by if we have any left, but those are all territorial animals, whether it's a fur bear, whether it's a raptor. And there's a fight to the death. And there's no net increase to the wildlife population as a result of that. The ones that are unfortunate enough to wander off into an area that's already been clear cut, there's no habitat, there's no shelter, there's no food, there's nothing for that particular animal, and they perish. So, when we look at that, and we look at establishing a value and say it's low value stuff, we're just going to chip it and haul it away, does the minister take into consideration all of these other factors and values that are on the land?
Minister.
Thank you very much. The member makes a point about value and how is value calculated, and makes a reference to what's described as sometimes as low-value timber. What we did do as part of the change in forest policy is bring about the elimination of the requirement for, in submitting forest stewardship plans to the ministry, to eliminate the requirement that not to, and the language was not to unduly impact timber supply, which was basically, the entire focus was on economic timber values, and that focus has been removed. So one is entitled to consider other values, and in fact, that's, I would say, a requirement. One would be biodiversity and ecosystem management, and that, I think, would address some of the concerns that the member has raised. The third consideration in the era of climate change and wildfire hazard is to consider public safety and the fuel load that any area might represent, and tailor any harvesting plan in that way to take into account public safety. So the range of values has shifted, and it is no longer focused entirely upon timber values.
Member, Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate the minister's answer. And my report on getting the balance rate that I put out in 2015 as parliamentary secretary did make the recommendations to remove that particular clause. It was an off-ramp that I saw in the regulations that caused me concern on enforcement. It should have been taken out a long time ago. And some of the other recommendations I made in that report, I'm glad to see that the minister has incorporated into some of the changes to the Forest Act. But it's not moving quickly enough. And in my humble opinion, I think the ministry is sending out mixed messages with respect to those changes under the Forest Act. And with respect to some other comments about a robust industry, I'm wondering how we're going to have a robust industry when I look and I see what we have out there for primary forest that's left, and the urgent requirement for us to cease cutting that primary forest because of the loss of biodiversity that we will never get back, and as a source for trying to introduce the extirpated wildlife into some of our regions that has been extirpated as a result of overharvesting. So we're not moving quickly enough, in my humble opinion on this. And I think the urgency is heightened by Professor Alila's scientific studies on hydrology, but the catastrophic loss of wildlife that we see right across the province, and the snail's pace in which government is approaching the old growth deferral area, trying to appease, and I understand that, and I do understand the concern about the folks that are involved in the forest sector and working, but at the end of the day, if there's no raw material to bring in, then what? What do we do? And one of the other, maybe I'm just editorializing now more than questioning, but one of the other, I first went to government back in 2000, early 2000s, concerned about the cumulative impacts of resource development and of forestry. And I went to them several times over this, and I saw the development of the cumulative effects strategy. And I thought, okay, this is a step in the right direction. But here we are just about 20 years later, and we still have this cumulative effects framework that we're using as a process to guide our forest practices principles across the province here. But it hasn't been working. Any person, I'm just a regular guy, and if I can go out and see the impact that it has on biodiversity and wildlife populations and the hydrological impacts that we see on the land base, here we have a group of scientists that have been working on this for decades, and we don't seem to be any further ahead there. So, strong action and affirmative action needs to be taken to protect the remaining biodiversity that we have. Forestry needs to change. It will be forced into changing whether it wants to or not. But we can no longer maintain the status quo of forestry in the province here moving forward. So I said my piece. I know some of it might be controversial to some, but I think we need to have a real hard look at this and make some changes as quickly as we can. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Minister.
Thank you. I want to thank the member for his intervention. I would say that, and I share his sense of urgency. I'm not sure that we totally agree on the direction, but we are making changes. We are making, and he referenced a number of issues that he raised during the time of the previous government, and apparently he wasn't successful in persuading the government that he belonged to and to make those changes. So we are making changes, but you have to bring people with you, and that's what we're endeavoring to do. The Old Growth Strategic Review and its full implications and the way in which we're implementing, I think, is the industry, the forest industry understands that change is in order. And in fact, some parts of it they have accepted and digested, not without some objections and some suggestions for how it might be done differently. But nonetheless, I think we are proceeding forward. But we still have we still want to balance a vibrant and strong forest industry with the acknowledgement and incorporation of many of the values that the member expresses, and those are being considered in the new forest management approach that we're taking.
Recognizing the member for Peace River South. There we go.
Thanks, Chair. Welcome to the Chair.
Thank you.
I also want to thank my colleague, obviously, from Prince George Mackenzie, as I think the House has heard, and the Minister. He comes from a perspective that he's very passionate about. And one thing I love about our caucus is we sometimes agree to disagree on issues, but it's a good segue into some of the challenges actually that there are right now in the forestry sector. So in the time that I have, I want to make a couple of, I think, important points and get into a discussion here with the Minister on this. The Minister was at a meeting yesterday with three of our prominent unions that work in the forestry sector, as was his colleague and the other Minister that has part of the forestry portfolio, as well as the Premier, which was great to see. I think it was important for them to hear. But the reason why they put that meeting together is because the struggles and the concerns that they have, interesting to have and great to see, I would argue, that the unions representing their members are sounding the alarm that we've seen around the province. And I quickly looked through the white paper that they presented, and I really want to thank them for the work they did, because it really brought forward, as the Minister's already acknowledged the white paper and some of previous comments, some of the recommendations or ideas that they've put forward, which is, I think, really important, and they have some very good ones here. But I'm looking through some of the information in the white paper, and I think it's really important to highlight, from their concern, which I would say is not only their concern, it's my concern, our caucus's concern. I'm not to put words in the Minister's mouth, I know it's his concern as well, but it's where are we going to see the action on this? Because, one of the comments that they put in here, preserving, and I'm quoting, preserving remaining forest industry jobs must be a central goal of British Columbia's economic strategy in the years ahead, and the government cannot just be limiting itself to simply providing transitional assistance to workers displaced by the sector's continued crisis. And I think that's a really important piece to acknowledge, because and I've shared this frustration before, because I've had mills shut down in my community. There's a long list of mills that have been shut down in the last year or two. A lot of people who have lost their jobs. And the frustration that I'm hearing from not only those losing their jobs, but their family members and the communities as a whole, is people showing up and just saying, here's how you fill out your EI form. That doesn't cut it. When we have well-intentioned people from Work BC who show up and say, you know, there are other opportunities and other jobs. Well, when you have somebody who's worked in the forestry sector in a good family supporting job, and this white paper actually highlights how well-paying those jobs are and how they've helped build families and communities, to go from somebody who's maybe worked 25, 30, in some cases 35 years in the forestry sector, and saying, don't worry, we're going to train you to work in the tech sector in Vancouver, that doesn't cut it. And I think the minister can appreciate that that is a bit of a slap in the face, because we have had the situations exactly what I've just acknowledged, because people who have said, you know, I've worked my entire career in the forestry sector, and now there's nowhere for me to transition to in the forestry sector. In some cases, some companies have been able to do early retirement and shift people around, and I will acknowledge that. But that's not all. In fact, even right in the white paper under Table 2, in the last 5 years, these three unions have acknowledged that there's been 19,000 direct and indirect jobs that have been lost in the last 5 years in the forestry sector. Which means a decline of $650 million of lost wages in British Columbia, $3.5 billion a year. Sorry, that was a year, $650 million a year in lost wages, $3.5 billion a year in lost exports, and $1 billion a year in lost taxes. Those numbers aren't a surprise, I don't think, to anybody. When I look at the budget, I've seen the $1 billion decline in revenue to the province as well. So, with that, one of the biggest challenges, and I know the minister will have an opportunity to probably not contradict my comments because I'm reading out of the white paper, but more of the conversation of what are we going to do about it? I think that's the main thing, because the minister has said time and time again, and I agree with the minister, that there's amazing opportunities for forestry in the province of British Columbia, for jobs, for our communities. I agree wholeheartedly with the minister. How does that transfer, though, into on-the-job action? Well, how that happens mostly is around permits, getting people to work. The minister heard from one of my colleagues yesterday around aspen planers, and I appreciate the answer he gave to that member from, sorry, what's her writing, Jackie? Yeah, I know, I always want to say Ashcroft because Fraser Nicola, thank you to the clerk, Fraser Nicola, I drew a blank there. So I appreciate the minister's response to her yesterday, but this is obviously province-wide, or if it's not province-wide, the minister can correct me. Because one of the challenges that I'm hearing from when I've met with the unions, when I've met with the companies, is the fact that it's taking too long to get permits. And when it takes too long, it doesn't create certainty. And when you don't have certainty, you don't have investment. So I believe, I'm trying to find the minister's information from last year he shared through his transition binder as well, but the target turnaround time for permits in the Ministry of Forests is 60 days. I believe that's what came out of last year. If I'm wrong, the minister can correct me, but that was actually in the minister's binder from what I remember last year. So 60 days. That's not what we're seeing on the ground. In fact, we're hearing some companies telling me it's over a year before they even get an answer. And sometimes the answer is no, but it's hard to make investment. So with that, setting the stage for my questions that I'll have, does the minister agree that it's taking too long to get permits out? Does he agree that this is one of the challenges that is facing the uncertainty in the province in the forestry sector that's actually costing jobs and shutting down mills? Or is, he might say that there's other avenues such as global pressures, et cetera, but what we have control over is timelines for certainty around permits. So can the minister maybe acknowledge, or at least give me his commentary on how long it should take for a permit to get out and whether he agrees that that's actually a hindrance to our forestry activities.
Minister.
Thank you. I want to begin by just talking about some of the comments that the member made in his introduction to his question. I'll deal with the issue of permits after I deal with that. But he did say that, and I agree with him that I hear that people don't necessarily want, some do, but they don't necessarily want to be offered a transition to retirement, although there are programs which are designed to assist that transition if people want it. But there are a number of other programs that I want to talk about. But I think the member really was unfair in his comments that people are invited by the Work BC team to work in the tech sector in Vancouver. I've never heard that, and I can't imagine that someone going to a remote or rural forest community and saying that we're going to train you to work in the tech sector in Vancouver. I just think that's being unfair to the skill and the understanding of the people that populate those programs and work in them. My encounters with them is that they're sincere, they know their stuff, and that's not the sort of recommendation that would be made. So I think it's a bit of a caricature and unfair to be characterizing those programs as consisting of people who give that kind of advice. So there are a number of programs. There's the Bridging to Retirement program, which is the Ministry of Labour, which I mentioned. There's the Skills Training program of the Ministry of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills. But within the Forest Worker and Community Supports program, there are funds that have been allocated for a forest employment program, which creates short-term employment to help forest and land-based contractors explore new work. It prioritizes areas impacted by mill closures and other forest impacts to reduce job losses in the community. So that's one program. A Rural Business and Community Recovery Initiative helps create jobs and support rural businesses and communities in hard-hit areas. Community Transition Services, it ensures that support is in place for workers and communities after community transition events such as mill closures. And so since fall of 2021, community transition teams have assisted 13 communities who have experienced a significant mill closure or curtailment, supporting approximately 1,870 impacted workers. There's also the issue or programs which are perhaps a slightly different focus, but a Rural Economic and Diversification Infrastructure Program. And so there is a range of programs that are offered in those circumstances that are sensitive to the community, the skills and the age and the family situation of the workers and members of the community that are involved. So that I think is a better way to, and a fairer way to characterize the programs that are available. But nevertheless, I want to then turn to the second area of the question that the member asked. The forest, particularly cutting permits, so the standard is, the member mentioned 60 days. The ministry has changed. Some of the other permits that were issued are now in the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship, and they have a different suite of programs and permits there. But specifically forest permits, and particularly cutting permits, the standard is 40 days, and 80% of the permits are issued within that 40 days. The other 20% are the more challenging ones, and they are the subject of what I've referred to as forest landscape planning. The industry supports this, First Nations support this, and typically these involve Indigenous consultation with Indigenous First Nations, sometimes multiple if there are overlapping jurisdictions within the targeted area. So, and that solution is supported by industry, by First Nations, and by communities, and that's why we've allocated money in the budget, and we've had some successful experiments. There have been 4 forest landscape plans already, and there are more underway, and the budget has been expanded to include that opportunity. So I'm optimistic that through that kind of guided dialogue with resources, that solutions can be reached and permits can be issued in a more timely way, and some of the bottlenecks and delays that have been encountered in the past will be eliminated.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Here's a challenge I have with the minister's answer, and I'm not Minister's, when he talks about 80% of permits out in 40 days, I'm sure the minister, and this is, I hope he's not taking this personally, that's not my intention, through the system though, within the minister and the ministry, that doesn't match what we're hearing on the ground. So maybe the minister could share some actual, not just percentages, but numbers, because I'll tell you, I've met with Kofi, I've met with the truck loggers, I've met with the unions, I've met with the Pulp and Paper Coalition, I've met with the Value Added Coalition, I've pretty well met with every single group in the province, as well as most of the companies that are part of Kofi. And the number one thing every single one of them have told me is that it's taking too long for permits. That mills are shutting down and people are losing jobs because it's taking too long to get permits. So if the minister is saying that 80% are in 40 days, that doesn't quite jive with what the feeling is from what I'm hearing on the ground. I've even had some companies, and my colleague from Caribou North, who's sitting next to me, knows this all too well in a forest-dependent community with West Fraser and others in proximity, who are struggling to keep their mills open. They're struggling to get fiber in the yards in order to keep operating. And the number one thing we always hear is there's no certainty on when we can get our permits. So I'm trying to square the circle here. So maybe the minister could actually, I'm sure his staff has some actual numbers. 80% sounds great. How many permits are outstanding that take more than the 40 days? Because again, it's really hard to go back to these communities. I look at mine, where we had a Canfor mill shut down in Chetwynd, for instance, and they told me, I don't want to, I guess I should be careful not attributing it to them, but you know, the rumor in the community, we'll say, is because it was taking too long to get permits, because of the caribou issue and closures to some of their tenure area, that the fiber supply is there, but there's no certainty from government to access. That's just one example that left a mill and a community devastated. So what kind of numbers are we talking that are taking more than 40 days? Because if we're having mills shut down and people losing jobs and the minister's trying to say everything sounds great, 80% of the permits are going out, that doesn't match what we're seeing in our communities around the province.
Minister.
Thank you. Just want to acknowledge that I too have met with all the groups that the member has referenced. I think what I would want to say about this is that there really are two separate phases to the issuing of a cutting permit, and sometimes in the mind of applicants these are merged. There is the formal process of when the permit is submitted and then adjudicated, and there's a statutory decision. But preparatory to submitting a permit, there is sometimes a very lengthy process that involves planning for the cut block, laying out the road, and having the kind of broad consultations with the community and Indigenous nations in some cases that takes some time. So the reference that I've given to the 80% time is from the time that the permit is formally submitted. But the time to prepare the permit to be in a state to be adjudicated or decided upon by an official in the ministry in accordance with the Act it sometimes takes a very long time. So that is why, with I think the general agreement of the Council of Forest Industries, truck loggers, many of the participants in the industry that the member has spoken of, and I would give the example of Quesnel because we have, I think the member cited Quesnel, there is a forest landscape plan process underway in the Quesnel region. It's almost concluded. And what the outcome of that is expected to be is that there will be then a 5-year plan for harvesting and cutting within the region, and there'll be some certainty to where those opportunities are, and there'll be general agreement from all parties that that's the way forward. So it's an effort to provide predictability and sustainability to the companies and the workers and the communities that are involved, and that's why this process is going forward, and that's why it's being replicated around the province.
Member.
Thank you to the minister, and I appreciate the point the minister is trying to say is once the official application, I guess, was within the ministry. I guess one of the challenges is the uncertainty on the landscape where it's taking a long time to get to that point. And I know in every situation there's different circumstances that lead to that. But the challenge is mills are shutting down, people are losing their jobs, communities are being impacted. And I think there's a leadership role here that can be played by government and the ministry as well on trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. My only political jab, I guess I'll make to the minister is his premier, former premier, publicly said that no mill would shut down under this government because they were going to make sure that they would have policies and programs in place to ensure that didn't happen. Very aspirational, didn't come to fruition, and right now it's like, so what do we do? So what we can do is we're hearing there's huge opportunity right now. We talked earlier today about some of the devastation that we had on the landscape with forest fires. And so that leads us into the conversation around salvage wood. I had the privilege of touring one of the plants at Adams Lake with Interfor, and it was amazing to see the few sticks that they were able to get through the mill that was in part of their tenured area that was burnt wood. And really, if you get them quick enough, depending on the species, that within the first year or 18 months, that you have a huge opportunity to salvage that for dimensional lumber in this case. The problem is we don't seem to have, and I'm hoping the minister will correct me, but we don't seem to have a program or a policy in place to be able to expedite permits in an area that maybe wasn't part of their tenured area already, to be able to access some of this salvage wood. I know and I'm hearing anyway, in Alberta, that in the case of a forest fire, that they will expedite a permit within 3 weeks and get people out working in order to access that fiber while they still can, and to keep mills open, to keep mills operational. I believe, as my colleague again sitting to my left from Caribou North, correct me if I'm wrong, but about 400 people out of work in her mills alone that could be working if there was some of that salvage wood that was accessible by some of those groups. So my question to the minister is, am I wrong? Is there a policy in place to expedite permits? And if there is, it doesn't appear to be working. If there isn't, what can we do to try to access the thousands of hectares of land that have valuable timber on it from last year in the forest fires? Because if we don't get on it this year and soon, that's a huge lost opportunity, not only for our mills and our jobs, but that's also stumpage and revenue to the province. And as I've talked to a lot of foresters, have said, you can get 25 years ahead of Mother Nature if you actually salvage some of that wood through policy of reforestation to try to rebuild and regrow those areas that have been devastated by fires. So to the minister then, he's heard those questions. Hopefully we have a good answer.
Minister.
Thank you. The member makes a good point about wildfire salvage, and indeed that's something that's come to my attention, and I have made my views known on it, I think, very, very clearly. There are a number of steps that have been taken to expedite wildfire salvage. We're a bit different from Alberta in the way in which we approach it. there are some steps that are required here in British Columbia that maybe are not taken in Alberta. I'm not sure. But nonetheless, there are steps that we've undertaken to expedite wildfire salvage, because as the member points out, it's a bit of it's like a food with a best before date. After a certain point, the quality of the wood, the burned wood, deteriorates and it's not usable for anything. I think the good news is that given the fiber pressures of mills and other operations, mills are much more accommodating and willing to accommodate fire-damaged wood. Previously, they would have rejected it. Maybe even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, they would not have adjusted their processes to take in fire-damaged wood. Many of them have adjusted and are quite willing to do that. So, but the steps that have been taken are including updating the pricing mechanisms. So there's guidance on pricing of wildfire-damaged timber that was published fairly recently. There's more flexibility and simple administration for salvage. There's the enabling of what's called ribbonless boundaries, so that the requirement for a formal survey is not the same. We've continued to fund the Forest Enhancement Society to support salvage, and we've implemented a number of wildfire salvage opportunity agreements. Those are taken up by First Nations. There's approximately 10 of those for over 1 million cubic meters of timber that have been issued in the last little while. So we're doing everything we can to expedite wildfire salvage, and I think our efforts are being enthusiastically received by the sector. As I say, it's important to undertake those measures before the wood degrades in value.
Member.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to thank the Minister and his staff. We're going to be moving on to Leader of the Third Party. I have a few colleagues that'll probably, just with the limited time we have, might submit some questions to the Ministry in writing, hoping to get some answers from that. But I do want to thank the Minister. It's, there wasn't a lot of time to dive into some of these really important issues. I'll be the first one to applaud if we can come up with policies that are going to save these mills, save these jobs, because most of us come from resource-dependent communities. As the Minister knows, and I don't take any opportunity, miss any opportunity to remind all of us that, this province was built because of forestry and mining and oil and gas and agriculture and all the great industries that have helped grow our populations, our families, feed our kids, and have a great life here in British Columbia. So we are hearing, though, and the Minister knows this, there's huge pressures right now on the landscape in forestry, and we all know we can't keep doing business as usual. Nobody's arguing that, but we still want to figure out how to do business. So that's going to be through policy change, through incentives, through pressure, through partnerships as well. So I just want to finish off by saying that, again, thanks to the Minister, and we want to make sure we do everything we can to have good policies in place to promote forestry going forward. Thank you very much, Chair.
Minister.
I want to thank the member for his participation and for his questions. I just would want to add that although I represent a riding in Surrey, many people don't realize that there's actually per-tap mills, a mill on the Fraser in my riding where they bring up logs on a chain and they send them off to a saw. There are other mills along the Fraser River in Surrey. So forestry is not necessarily an activity that is confined to small rural communities. It's also right in the heart of one of the biggest cities in the province along the Fraser River. So I say that just to suggest that, contrary to the beliefs of some, suburban or urban MLAs are not necessarily completely divorced from the ongoing active forest sector.
All right, thank you. Recognizing the Leader of the Third Party.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I guess I have a few minutes to get started with the questions here. Won't be any surprise, we're going to be interested in talking about old growth. And I've been reflecting on this. I think I think there's almost it's like we're talking two entirely different languages. I think when we stand up and ask questions about old growth, we're asking about ecosystems, we're asking about the role that old growth forests play in protecting biodiversity at a time when we are globally in the 6th mass extinction, when species are being extirpated. And we're talking about the small amount of old growth that's left in this province. And I think what often happens is, you know, the language that we're using isn't resonating, and then the language that comes back is all about, you know, the kind of economics or finances. And I think that there's got to be a way to bridge this, because there's a lot more than just the value of timber when we're talking about old growth. There's the value of the meter plus of soil underneath that timber that is absorbing enormous amounts of carbon every year. And that those trees are gone, that carbon absorption is gone. That a second growth or third growth forest is in a completely different ballpark when it comes to the capacity to capture and store carbon than an old growth forest. They're in a completely different ballpark when it comes to biodiversity. They're in a completely different ballpark when it comes to the kind of fundamental capacity to withstand forest fires. These trees have been standing for 400 years, 500,000 years. They've seen a lot of forest fire activity, but an old growth forest withstands forest fires in ways that second, third monoculture forests just can't. And we have a growing amount of evidence of this. And we unfortunately exist in a strange paradigm when it comes to climate change that doesn't want to, or that doesn't particularly measure the role that forests and ecosystems play in both capturing and emitting carbon. But there's a big global responsibility that I think we have as a province with some of these rare ecosystems. And so when we stand up and say we're pretty disappointed to see areas that had been set aside for deferral are now being put onto into cut blocks, is it feels like we get a political message from, say, the premier in an election campaign, and then we get a very different outcome from the government. And so, I don't know how to bridge the gap particularly, but I think it's an important one to contemplate. Logging in deferral areas, yesterday when I raised this question period, the minister indicated that First Nations are playing a role in the decisions around which areas that are marked for deferral are also being put up for logging. My question is, in those circumstances, has conservation financing been put on the table for those nations as an alternative to the revenues that they would get from logging the old growth?
Minister.
Okay, thank you. The chair would like me to adjourn, but I think what I'd like to do is answer. I won't take long, and perhaps we can continue this tomorrow. I note that the member expressed support for the consultation process that is underway in Clayoquot, just initiated a public process yesterday. And that is an example where conservation financing is being utilized by the nations involved to, the consultation isn't complete, so I don't want to prejudge the outcome, but conservation financing is available to set aside conservancy areas for the nations involved, plus some of the areas proposed in the consultation will be set aside for individual community forest licenses for individual bands. So the variety of, and I just give that as an example of an example where conservation financing is at play. Many of the nations, I've spoken with the staff in the TAP process, the Technical Advisory Program. Many of the First Nations took the position that they weren't consulted in the TAP program. It did not reflect their values. It did not reflect local knowledge. And they had a very different idea of what might be done in any particular region or circumstance in their territory. So the process then went into negotiations, and that's where the changes and the departure from the TAP recommended deferrals came about. It's because those First Nations chose different areas that they wanted to see conserved as opposed to the ones that were recommended. And the number started out at 1.2 million hectares, which is a vast area, but through the process grew to be 2.42 million hectares. So I'm told by staff that no nation involved in that has directly asked for conservation financing, but many of the nations, I think, are aware of that option. And historically, there are many First Nations, and this may be something that is not widely known. There are many First Nations that have been involved in forestry for many years. It's a tradition within the nation. And they're very proud of the work that they do as in the forest industry. It's been a source of employment for generations within some nations, not all by any means. But so there's a variety. All I'm trying to say is there's a variety of responses, and what we decided to do as a government is to respect those individual First Nation responses, which are different. And the assumption is not that First Nations, every First Nation is being obliged under the pressure of economic circumstances to engage in forest activity. Some very willingly and proudly want to engage in that as a source of employment and business for their nation. So that, I think, is how I would express an answer to that. Perhaps I can now move the motion. I move that the chair rise and report progress and ask leave to sit again.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that the committee rise, report progress, and seek leave to sit again. All those in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none. Thank you, members. This committee stands adjourned.